Welcome back to RBD Block Challenge. I'm Cindy Cloward, and today we are working on block number 10, designed by Sue Daley, and it's called Follow the Leader. Look at all these flying geese going around in the circle. This is what it looks like in batiks. This is what it looks like in our confetti cotton solids. But whatever you're sewing with, we're glad you're here with us. Like always, the first thing you need to do is download the pattern from our Riley Blake Designs website. Follow the leader. We'll put the pattern over here. I've already cut out all my pieces and we're ready to get started on our flying geese. So the first thing the pattern tells you to do is grab your E squares or your rectangles and your B squares right here. And we are just going to make 4 flying geese at a time. But if you want to make them all at once, you can look ahead at all the different pieces to make the other flying geese. So first thing you need to do is mark corner to corner. I'm just going to mark 2 because I do have a Seam So Easy guide. And that is going to be your sew line. So you're going to grab your flying geese. You're going to line it up. Now a tip, if you've been making flying geese for a while, then you're going to know this tip. But it's really, really important that your top and your bottom, but especially your top, is lined up flush with the top of your rectangle. And you want to make sure it's right there in the corner, and we're going to sew from this corner off that edge. That's super important. So I'm going to do the other, I guess I only have 3 of each color. But we've got 6 squares for the other side. So we're going to line those all up. And sometimes, I don't always do this, but instead of putting a pin in the square on the rectangle, sometimes I like to do a temporary heat adhesive, and it keeps it into place. Okay, one of the tips I want to give you about making your flying geese is when you have your marked line, or if you're sewing with your Seam So Easy guide, just offset your stitching a thread or 2 to the outside of this marked line towards your corner, and that allows the fold to come over, and so you've got this really nice flying geese edge. Sometimes if you're right on the line or going to the inside, you're going to be short on this outside corner. That's one of my tips. I would love to hear your tip as well, what works for you. So I'm going to press these again, and then we'll take it to the machine and sew. I can show you how I do it on my Seam So Easy guide. Going a hair or 2 on the inside of there. Okay, so we'll line these up. Again, I'm just going to line up my needle just slightly. So I'm going to just sew slightly to the outside. It's hardly even going to be visible, but it's just enough that when you make that flip, it's going to line up perfectly. So I've got that lined up. Again, for this, I'm just kind of lining that just slightly on, actually, just slightly on that side of the line, ever so slightly. So your center line, you're just going a hair or 2 or a thread or 2 to the left. So we'll take it over here and I'll show you what I mean. So you can take a look at that. I just ever so slightly stitched just to that side. So when we flip it back like this, it's going to line up perfectly with your rectangle. So now we're going to trim these down to our 1/4 inch there. Oops, we go right here. And last one. Let's take it over to our pressing station. We're gonna grab our 3 squares to put on the other side. And we're gonna first press these open. So I kind of set my stitches, warm up the fabric. And it's really important to finger press that open to make that continuous rectangle. Let it cool underneath clapper. Let those cool. I did mark one of these. And if you like to mark all of them, that's great, no problem. Just saves me a little bit of time. So this is exactly what I want to see, how it crosses right here at the top. We line that up perfectly like that. And again, I'm just gonna sew a thread or two slightly towards the corner, the outside corner. Give that a press. So what we want to see is we flip that open like that, and we have a nice 1/4 inch from the tip there to the edge of our fabric. So that looks good. We're going to trim that down to 1/4 inch from our seam allowance on all 3 of these Flying Geese units. Okay, let's take it to our pressing station. I'm gonna have to trim that thread off. Catch that in just a minute. Give it a nice good press. Lay that down. Our 3 units are ready to be trimmed up. And I really like to use our trim-it rulers for this. They're 4.5 inches. And again, it's a really nice way for you to make sure the sides are accurate. You're not going to be able to worry about the bottom, but usually you never have to worry about the bottom anyway. And you can really point that center point right there, and you can make sure you have that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because we took such care, I don't think we need to trim up at all. There was just a couple threads I'm grabbing. So that's done. We're gonna just hurry and trim up all 3. That looks good. And then the last one, we're just checking. And that is just great. I'm just gonna trim off the thread at the bottom. Okay, so these 3 units, these 3 Flying Geese are ready to go. We are gonna do the rest of our Flying Geese, and I'll meet you back here. We just have 3 more sets. So this is my last Flying Geese unit, and I'm just gonna check it out to see if it needs to be trimmed up at all, and it does not. If you are having trouble with your Flying Geese, this is a really good tool because you can measure it here, but if you have parts of it that are sticking up and below, just push it up here and measure. Do you see that? See how that fits in that angles perfectly? That's how your flying geese should look, and there really shouldn't be anything on the outside. If there is, that usually means that this area has not been sewn correctly. So that's a good way for you to check and recheck your flying geese unit, and to make sure if you're having troubles, you can check yourself in your sewing, and that should line up perfectly. And that does. So we're really glad for that. And now we're ready to assemble our block. We've got all these units to put together, but the instructions are a little unique. So make sure you look at the instructions, because you're not going to assemble all the units the same way. So we're going to grab our yellow units like this, and we're only going to put 2 of the flying geese together. So let's make sure they're going the same direction and right sides together. Since we have squared these up, the sides should match. And you can pin it, but they should line up perfectly, 4.5 inches side to side. And we're just going to take it to the machine and sew. Now, when I sew my flying geese, or any kind of points that I have a point on one side, I like to sew on the side that my point is. So I make sure I'm not sewing through my point, and I can make sure I keep my stitching on this side of that point. And I'm going to do that with this unit. So let's line it up like that. And then we can just be mindful of this point and not sew into it right there. And you should be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it should work out just right. But you know, things happen in our stitching, and we want to make sure we don't sew into that point. And see, I'm just a thread or 2 on the outside of that point, so that's great. So let's take it over to our pressing station, and we're going to press it open. And this is how it should look at. That point should just be right below that other unit. So that's good to go. So we've got that. Make sure it's going the right way. That's going to go that way. Now we've got our green blocks, and we are going to sew, I'm going to put this down here, these 3 flying geese together. So that is going to go 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to sew this unit to that unit. So let's go sew. Okay, that looks good. Let's take it to our pressing station. Open it up. Okay, so that looks great together. Now we're making sure the flying geese are going around in the circle. So that is turned on its side. And now we're going to flip this over, and this seam we want to line up with the point here. So just be mindful of placement, and then sometimes I just put a pin in there so it doesn't shift. There is going to be a little bit of bulk there, so if you want to just flip that yellow seam the opposite direction, I think I'm going to give it a press since I already pressed it that way. And again, I've got my glass head pins, so I can just press on top of that pin. So I'm just going to press it that way and stitch down the side right there. Okay. Let's take it to the pressing station. Look how that tip just lines up with that bottom seam. That is working out just perfectly. All right, so that unit is ready to go. The next thing we need to do on the pattern is we're gonna sew, let's see, it doesn't tell you exactly what order, but we're gonna sew these 2 units together, these 2 units together, and then this is gonna be sewn to that, and then we'll sew that section together. So let's sew these 2 units together. So I like laying everything out since I'm such a visual learner. So I just lay it out and go one step at a time. Okay, we'll open that up. So that is ready to go. I'm gonna put those right sides together. I'm gonna take that over here. I'm gonna sew that next. Again, I like to sew down the side where I can see my point. Make sure I don't sew into that point. Give it a press, open it up. There we go. Now we're going to take this, and again, I'm going to line up this point with that seam right there. So I just do this little peekaboo like that. Line that up there. I'm going to flip that seam over so there's less bulk. I'm going to take it to my pressing station because I did want that seam going the other way. Those glass head pins come in handy. Open that up. Okay, that's looking good. Let's lay that down here. Now we're going to flip that over here. Now I'm going to finger press that over so we can nest those seams. Actually, I'm going to press it real fast. So we're going to nest those seams right here. My 2 outside edges should line up. If they're not, just give it a little tug. They should line up. Okay. This is finished. Now let's just sew these last 3 flying geese together. We'll put it on this outside. All right, let's give that a good press. Looking good. Make sure they're going the right direction. Again, we want that circle around that center square. Let's put this right sides together. We're going to nest those seams. And since we flipped that out, that nests very well right there. Now, again, be mindful of that seam right there and the point here. I'm just going to put a pin in there. Just put it right there. And there's some bulk, so I'm going to flip that seam over. Just going to flip that whole seam over so there's less bulk. Since there's kind of a bulk, I am going to just press it real fast. Flip that over. Okay. Give it a good press. Look how that is coming there. It looks really nice. Okay, our last seam. So lay that out. We're gonna nest our seams here, and then we're gonna make sure that point lines up here. And this, as long as that is nested there, that should line up really well. So let's flip that over. And since those are going in, I'm going to flip that seam out. That's going in, I'm going to flip this seam out. And I'm going to line that up right there. I'm going to put a pin right there. Now there's a flying geese on both sides, so just choose which side you want to sew on. I'll put a pin on the outside. All right, well, let's go sew. Give it a good last press. Sometimes if you got those bulky seams, it's nice to give it a little spritz. It just further loosens up the fabric and gives you really flat. Gives you a really flat block. Okay, that is looking good. Let's move this out of the way, and the last thing we need to do is square up our block if needed. If we have cut our pieces accurately and sewn them accurately, we should be good to go. And it looks good to me. We don't want to cut off any of our points. And our Follow the Leader quilt block is finished. This was a fun quilt block designed by Sue Daley. I enjoyed working on my flying geese technique. I gave you a few of my tips and tricks. As always, we welcome your comments and your tips and tricks on your creating flying geese. Well, join us next time for block number 11, Sparkle and Shine by Heather Peterson.